I think we were talking about how bystanders began to congregate around the event, right?
I believe so, yes.
And you would agree that over the course of time, some of the bystanders who were observing the event became more excited.
More concerned, I would phrase it.
Their voices grew louder.
Yes.
They began name calling, essentially.
Correct.
And as that increased, or as the time went on, the intensity of the crowd increased.
Yes, they became more concerned.
Now, we looked at, I'm going to talk about Exhibit 110, if we could publish 110. So this again being what some people would call the use of force continuum, or what the Minneapolis Police Department calls the Defense and Control Response Training Guide, correct?
Yes.
Essentially, this is a graphic illustration in terms of, based upon the subject's behavior, how much force is authorized, correct?
Correct.
The onus or the focus being on the suspect's behavior initially, correct?
Correct.
And the response to that behavior, right?
Correct.
Now, again, we don't look at a use of force in a vacuum, right?
No, we do not.
We don't look at it, in singular frames, right?
Correct.
We look at the totality of the circumstances, right?
Yes.
And an officer, a reasonable officer, would take into consideration what has happened with the suspect a few minutes ago, correct?
Correct.
And try to use that information to inform what could potentially happen in the future. Agreed?
Agreed.
That's what reasonable officers do.
Yes.
So if I'm a police officer and me and my two partners just 2 minutes ago were fighting with someone, right? And our efforts became futile, right? That's going to affect how we perceive might happen in the future with that, what we perceive might happen in the future with that person.
This is something to be concerned about, correct?
Right. Because, in fact, oftentimes people who become compliant after a struggle start to struggle again, right?
In certain instances, yes.
It happens, right?
Yes, it does.
Someone who said, almost to like catch their wind again, right? And start fighting again, right?
In certain instances, yes, but in most cases, officers are trained that you can only go by what the suspect's actions are at the time. You can't say, oh, well, I thought he or she was going to do this, so then I'm going to use this force.
Okay.
It has to be based on their actions.
An officer's use of force can exceed the suspect's use of force, right?
The
suspect's behaviors, right?
Yes.
That's the design, correct?
In certain instances, yes. It has to be proportional.
Right. Meaning this concept of proportionality. If I call you a name, and I'm a police, or if I call you a name, you're a police officer, you can't pull your gun out and shoot me, right?
Correct.
That would be a disproportionate use of force to the threat I
perceived, yes.
Right. And so the mere fact that force is being applied, it's not second by second. We have to look at it in a longer context, right?
Yes, but you are constantly reassessing during that time frame.
Constantly reassessing. Now, I presume you've gone through firearms training?
Yes.
And I presume that you have had situations where you, in your firearms training, are confronted with multiple threats, right?
Yes.
And your training teaches you to deal with the most active threat, right?
Correct. Or the closest threat.
The closest threat or the biggest threat, correct? And so you want to neutralize or contend with that potential threat before you deal with the lesser threats.
Yes.
Right? And again, in this, this cycle, the critical decision-making model, that's coming both in terms of what you're dealing with in the suspect, right? That critical decision-making model is occurring.
Yes.
It's dealing with what's around you and what you're observing around you,
Your
right?
environment, yes.
It's dealing with other people that may be there,
Yes.
right? And it's dealing with using that same model to take all of your training and experience and things of that nature too, right?
Correct.
Right. So there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions being made every nanosecond almost, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And simply because a person is not fighting with you, right? If I'm not fighting with you, that doesn't mean you still can't use some sort of force to control me, right?
It depends on the circumstance.
According to the Minneapolis Police Department, if someone is passively resisting you, that means they're not fighting with you, right?
Correct.
Force can still be used, right?
Yes, in certain instances.
Right.
Depending on, again, the suspect's actions.
Again, including joint manipulation, pressure points, escort holds, or what we would call just a restraint, right?
Yes, and again, a lot of that depends on what the police response should be at that time. If it's where the officers decided that this person needs to go to jail, they're going to take them into custody, then those would come into play. If it's just more of a, hey, can we talk to you, or detaining them, then it may just be verbalization. So it just depends on the circumstances.
Right. And obviously, if we want to protect that person, and we know that EMS is on its way, we can continue to restrain that person for EMS if they have a medical need for EMS, right?
It depends on the circumstance.
And ultimately, it's depending upon the reasonable officer analysis, right?
Yes. And what's expected from that specific agency, what their expectations are of the officer's performance, as well as best practices as well. Those are taken into consideration.
And ultimately, under the Graham versus Connor analysis, it's the specific facts of the specific case. Agreed? What the officer is seeing at the scene, right?
Yeah, when we're talking about force, correct.
Yep. All right. Now, again, you've had an opportunity to review a lot of the Minneapolis Police Department's training materials.
Yes, sir.
Some of which you found useful and some of which you didn't, right?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that your review of those materials were more focused on defensive tactics, use of force training, and policies and things of that nature?
Correct.
And so I'm presuming that the more recent materials would be more illustrative or informative to you informing your opinions, right?
Yes, based on what was current at the time of the incident.
Right. And you have seen the workforce director, the list of the programs that Officer Chauvin took?
Yes.
And you're familiar that Officer Chauvin, according to those records, took Phase 1 defensive tactics in the year 2020, March of 2020.
Yes, I believe so.
Did you review Phase 1 defensive tactics training materials for March of 2020?
I believe I did, yes.
If we could take this down, Your Honor. I'm just showing the witness. Can you see what's in front of you, sir?
Yes.
You'd agree that this appears to be the training materials for the 2020 in-service Phase 1 that would have been seen by Officer Chauvin?
Yes.
And
That was one slide, yes.
And if we just look at the presentation, this is a presentation that largely deals with demonstrations, protests, crowd control, right?
Yes.
Large crowds, small crowds, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
This would have been training that Mr. Chauvin had roughly a month or two before this incident, right?
Correct.
Does this appear to be a true and accurate copy of what you would have reviewed?
Yes.
I have previously marked this as Exhibit 1032, and I would move for its admission.
Is this the single slide, Council?
The entire program.
All right. Any objection?
Yes, Your Honor. Foundation.
Bates is... $29.71 to 21096. It's the 2020 use of force in service. Large crowd management overview.
And your objection continues?
It does, Your Honor. We just have one more.
Yeah.
Okay,
large crowd. On a crowd, he's justifying the killing of the...
No objections.
I'm sorry, no objection?
No objections.
All right. 1032 is received.
I'm showing you what I believe is slide 39 of this, and I'd ask permission to publish. This is the Minneapolis Police Department training materials on dealing with crowds, right?
With large crowds.
Large
yes.
crowds. Crowds, officers are trained, crowds are dynamic creatures and can change rapidly, right?
Yes.
You would agree with that?
In this particular training for large crowds, correct.
But even in small crowds, even if you have 10 people or 12 people, crowds are dynamic creatures, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And they can change very suddenly, right?
Yes.
Just a second, Your Honor. If we could take that. Oh, this is on. And I agree that this deals with larger crowds and larger protests.
Yeah, the training is specifically for mobile field force. I'm an instructor for mobile field force as well, so yeah, I'm familiar with similar training.
Yep. And again, officers, they are experiencing this training, right?
Yes.
And they're taught never underestimate a crowd's potential, right?
Correct.
And again, crowds being unique to the particular circumstances of a particular case, right?
Correct.
And so ultimately, when an officer is on scene and he's making a decision to use force and a crowd assembles, whether they're peaceful or not peaceful, an officer, a reasonable officer, has to be aware of what they're doing, right?
Absolutely.
And that can distract an officer.
In certain instances, yes.
And as people start trying to communicate to the officers, that can take their, whether it's, even if it's just peaceful, hey officer, hey Sergeant Steiger, let's talk. That's distracting that officer from what he or she is doing, right?
Yes.
Right?
It can.
It can. And an officer has to be prepared for the unexpected. A reasonable officer does, right?
Yes, they're always mitigating the risk.
And I understand that part of what an officer has to do is assess the words someone may be saying and comparing it to the tone of how they're saying it, right?
Yes.
That's what a reasonable officer does, right?
Yes.
If I say, hello, Sergeant Steiger, versus, hello, Sergeant Steiger, right? There's two different tones, and my tone can convey meaning.
Yes.
Right? And if I start calling you names, that conveys a meaning, right?
Yes.
And saying things like, you're a fucking pussy, you're a bitch, that conveys a particular intent. Agreed?
I wouldn't say an intent, no.
And a reasonable officer could foresee that or see that, perceive that as a threat.
Name calling? I would say it depends on the officer's training and experience.
Okay. An officer, a reasonable officer, could perceive the words that people are saying and the tone that it is being said in as a threat or a risk to the officer's safety. Agreed?
A risk, possibly, but officers are typically trained that when it comes to verbal threats in and themselves, that you can't just use that only to justify force.
Now, you've had, again, an opportunity to review Minneapolis Police Department's training materials. Oh, if we could take this down. Sorry. Can you see what's in front of you, sir?
Yes.
You reviewed, I presume, as a part of your analysis, the Minneapolis Police Department's crisis intervention technique training, right?
Yes.
And I'm not seeking to admit this, but officers are trained to look at potential signs of aggression, right?
Yes.
The Minneapolis Police Department trains its police officers how to potentially perceive an aggressive behavior of a person, right?
Correct.
And that includes raising voices, right?
Yes.
That includes people tensing muscles, right?
Yes.
Exaggerated gestures, pacing, right? That can be a sign of an aggressive behavior. Right?
Yes. Typically, those are when you're dealing with you're one-on-one with a specific subject or engaged in a specific call for service. That's
right.
Typically when the training is given is for that, when it's more of a one-on-one, when you're dealing with a subject one-on-one.
That's the training. But in terms of now you are an officer and you're engaged with the suspect, right? And somebody else is now pacing around and watching you and calling you names and saying you're a fucking pussy. This could be viewed by a reasonable officer as a threat.
As a potential threat, correct.
And in fact, when that happens, if you look at the slide in front of you, when how a person is talking to an officer, if they're mimicking them or rageful, officers are specifically trained to try to predict future behavior based on that. Correct?
Yes, to prepare themselves.
Right. And when someone starts threatening you, it's a possibility that an officer can view that as a potential deadly assault is about to happen. That's what they're trained.
Yes, that's what they're trained. It says what is the person's likely behavior.
Now, you testified that, did you listen to every single thing that the crowd or the people were saying?
I attempted to, yes.
Right.
Some of it you can't make out, but yes, for the most part, yes.
And you would agree that if someone were to say, if you touch me like that, I would like to slap the fuck out of you, right? That could be viewed as a threat.
Yes.